Welcome to everyone, and everyone's still trickling in. Prior to getting started, I do want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded and will be posted on the WFRN website, so just be mindful of that. On behalf of WFRN, President Ellen Galinsky and Executive Officer Stephen Sweet, I'd like to welcome everyone to this exciting event which focuses on work-family justice for LGBTQ plus individuals. I think this is going to be a very dynamic, exciting panel discussion, and so I appreciate all of you joining us today. My name is Richard Petz. I'm an executive board member of WFRN and co-organizer of this event, along with Sarah Damask and Jen Hook. I want to thank the Population Research Institute at Penn State University for co-sponsoring our virtual conference series. I would like to welcome and thank all members of WFRN who are able to attend this event today. If you are not a member of WFRN, I would like to invite you to become part of this fantastic community, and we will post a link in the chat where you can become a WFRN member. Thank you, Steve. Today we have four wonderful panelists who are all experts on LGBTQ plus work-family issues. They are Abby Goldberg, Professor of Psychology at Clark University, Jamie Ladge, newly promoted Professor and Group Chair in the Diamore McKim School of Business and Management and Organizational Development at Northeastern University, John Charles Langelaire from Jonkoping International Business School and JCL Coaching, and Deborah Wittes, Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs and Professor of Law, and Ira C. Batman Faculty Fellow at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. We also have Alexandra Beauregard, Professor of Organizational Psychology and Assistant Dean in the School of Business, Economics, and Informatics at Birkbeck University of London, who will be moderating the panel discussion today. Thank you all for being here today, and I very much look forward to your thoughts on this important and understudied topic. So the plan for today is that our panelists will each be given a few minutes to provide opening remarks on today's theme. I will then turn it over to Alex, who will lead a discussion among the panelists, and we will wrap up with audience Q&A at the end. So I will start by turning to the panelists for their opening remarks, and I'll just go in alphabetical order, starting with Abby.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. So I just wanted to kind of give a bit of an overview of my work and kind of highlight a couple of themes that have really stood out to me over the years that I've been doing this work related to work-family issues. So my research primarily focuses on family diversity, and specifically much of it focuses on LGBT parents and adoptive parents across different life transitions. So in particular, I've been studying a group of lesbian, gay, and heterosexual couples as they've adopted their children and then followed them now for actually about 15 years. So we're currently in our 9th follow-up, and the kids are now teenagers. And we started following them before these folks had even adopted. And what it really stands out is the sort of unique context of adoption that sort of includes same-sex couples, but goes beyond them. LGBT folks are more likely to adopt children than heterosexual cis folks, somewhere between 6 to 10 times more likely. So the issues around adoption uniquely affect them, but they really affect all adoptive parents. And this really kind of comes to the fore when we think about work-family issues because of the challenges that kids who are adopted often bring. So when a couple or a person adopts, they are, if they're lucky, given the same leave as a couple who, say, has a biological child. But if you're adopting a child who's 7, 8, 9 years old, say through the foster care system, or you're adopting a child internationally, you know, there's a lot of really unique issues that warrant additional time off, not just in that initial bonding period. You know, if we care so much about attachment, right, we really want to prioritize that initial period of closeness and togetherness, but the ongoing challenges that may come up as that child or those children grow up. So being able to have, as we know, a flexible work schedule and an understanding workplace environment is so important for folks who adopt. who are really, often parenting children who are high needs and need a lot of support. And parents often talk about, needing to take significant and unexpected time off to deal with their children's challenges. So that's one thing that really comes up for me. I have absolutely no idea how long I've been talking, so somebody cut me off. I'm going on too long. The other thing that really stands out for my work is the folks who are trans and who become parents, again, have really unique family issues, especially around the transition to parenthood. So trans folks often will go off hormones in order to become pregnant. And this can involve, again, sort of maybe some additional emotional and physical challenges, but may also warrant some additional support and some additional time off. And I'm happy to get into any of these things later. I just wanted to kind of hit a couple of areas. The other final thing I wanted to mention is just how diverse the workplaces are that my families sort of inhabit, and that their experiences of stigma versus support, for example, vary so significantly depending on where they live, as well as what kind of work environment they're in. So think about a gay man who is, say, a cis gay man, who's employed in a corporate job versus doing, some sort of manual labor, for example, or being a teacher in the South right now versus, working in the arts in the Northeast, right? So there's all of these really important intersections that shape these folks' experiences at work, which of course they bring home with them as well. So I'll just stop there. I don't know how long I've been talking, but feel free to probe me during the Q&A for more on any of those topics.
Thanks, Abby. That was perfect. Now we will turn to Jamie.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. And thank you for acknowledging the promotion, because as I said to the participants when we got on, that usually my family does not acknowledge that. It's nice to be among a community that does. So I've been a professor at Northeastern for the last 15 years. I'm also a distinguished research professor at the University of Exeter Business School. And I want to just put out there that I am a cisgender heterosexual woman. So I acknowledge my own privilege, as well as probably some ignorance that I have. And there's been a lot of learning that I've had to do along the way in trying to understand the different populations that I've studied. When I began my academic career, my primary focus was on work-family dynamics more generally, also interweaving, not surprisingly, ideas around diversity, equity, belonging and inclusion, and also career and career development. So my particular focus in all of those areas is really looking at the individual experience, looking at the identity dynamics, looking at how people manage their identity, particularly in the context of identity transitions. One of my first studies that I was involved in was looking at parents, particularly mothers, as they transition to becoming a first-time mother and going back to work, and looking at that reentry experience. And I've since moved on from, I'm still studying mothers in different contexts, but also studying fathers, same-sex couples, and then more recently looking at the trans community. So I'll talk a little bit about, some of the projects that I've been lucky to be involved in, and worked with some really great collaborators in that space. I have to also say, I think a lot of the work we do is important to ourselves and for a variety of reasons, whether, depending on how you identify or what your social identities are or your experiences are. I personally believe that me-search is important. So when I say I started out studying, new mothers, I was a relatively new mother myself. I had no idea that that was something you could even study in a business school context, but people said you should study this, and so I did, and I love how it's kind of evolved into these different areas. I will study any underrepresented group in organizational life. I appreciate and want to hear those perspectives, because I think when we get into discussions around research, one of the biggest challenges with our research is not hearing those voices in the studies that are out there. I'll just highlight three of my studies that are probably most relevant to this conversation. One is a study that we published in Journal, well, actually two are studies that are published in Journal of Vocational Behavior, actually, that were in a special issue The first looks at the identity dynamics of lesbian mothers, and that was a really interesting study looking at some comparisons between how non-birth and birth mothers experience identity validation, their validation as a mother, as they either navigate the workplace or transition back to work, depending on whether they had taken any kind of formal leave. And that was data that was collected by one of my longtime collaborators, Sophie Hennekam. And again, that was published in the Journal of Vocational Behavior. I believe it was around 2017 or 2018 when it came out. In that same issue, I also did a project that was based on published a study that was based on Katina Sawyer's dissertation, which looked at the work-family conflict that same-sex families and couples experience and how stigma can be an added layer of work-family conflict on top of all of the other types of work-family conflict that all of us in the work-family community have long studied. And so, we looked at that and how that played a role. I do have an interesting story about that paper that I will save for later when we talk about research. Like Abby, I'm not sure how long I've talked, so I'll save it for later. But I will say that when we talk about where to publish this stuff and whether journals are amenable to this, I will say that paper originally had an R&R at ASQ. Administrative Science Quarterly, which is, I would say one of the most premier journals in our field, or many different fields across management, applied psychology, even sociology. And I'll explain later why it was rejected, but I think it speaks to some of the challenges of publishing some of this work. And then lastly, more recently, I have a paper that is in press at Academy of Management Journal, and it's looking at, also with Sophie Hennekam, that's looking at how trans people navigate their gender identity transitions and how they navigate expressing their gender over the course of their transition period in the context of work. And that was a super interesting study for me to be involved in. We got started at the beginning of the pandemic. I would walk for hours and hours because that was all I could do when I was homebound, and listen to books on audiobooks about the experiences of trans individuals and how they navigate all different facets of their life, but particularly how it's affected in the workplace. And that paper really, that took lots of iterations to get into the Academy of Management Journal, 5, I think, plus it had gone through 2 rounds at another journal and then got rejected. But what that paper is really ultimately all about is about authenticity. And what I learned through that population is the evolving nature of authenticity, and not really questioning what it means to be authentic, but do we know how to be authentic? And studying a population like the trans community is really provides some really important insights into how to understand that idea of how people bring their authentic selves to work and how it evolves and changes over time.
Thank you, Jamie. I will turn it over now to John Charles.
Yes, so good afternoon from Sweden, as we could say soon in Eurovision. I will not give you points, but of course I will present me. So some of you knows me, I'm a researcher in work life since now 22 years, time flies. And my focus is on boundary development and boundary management from a social construction perspective, as well as from a narrative perspective, so that we are constructing our life, we are constructing the way we are handling our life, and we do that for ourselves. And I'm joining Jamie in terms of identity. So we create our narrative for our identity, but we are creating also for our social interaction. And in order to, as Jamie was putting a couple of times, to navigate in the work life. So that's my research. I'm actually also a coach. So I've decided to leave a little bit the academia for a little while. I was a little bit upset by how the academic world is working. And part of this upset was due to the fact that I was actually pointed out in my university that are supposed to be open. I was pointed out as a gay person, and I was discriminated by my manager myself when I actually started to be not more open. I've always been open with my identity, but it really came into a conflict. And in that regard, so this also has raised since a long time my interest in how do LGBTQ plus whatever you want, maybe, and we can discuss if we should put all in one or if we should divide. How do they actually build their different life domains? Which life domains become important or less important? Have a lot reflecting in a sense of if your family, meaning your biological father, your biological mother are actually rejecting you, but we are socially constructing a new family. So we go to the so-called community and we find our allies in the community, and they become our parents, our fathers, our mothers. So all these, how do we construct these different domains? Which one is at the center of our life? And what happens when we do actually have so-called work-life preferences and where our social environment does not enable these social preferences? I have to hide, you have to hide, you have to find strategies, because when people are talking about their spouse, oh my God, I should be careful not to say he. So I have to find, and so I have to find new strategies, new tactics, when my environment may not actually accept my social orientation. And of course, we are not only in one social context, we are maybe having some strategy with our family, strategy with some friends. So we do have with our different social environment, different strategies, which for me leads that it could happen that LGBTQ plus person do have to develop basically so many set of rules, so many set of boundaries, and therefore get lost and get basically crazy because there have to be so many different persons in this different social interaction, which can actually explain why some LGBT person decide to end with their life. And that's I'm connecting with this. It's a difficulty. And when people are not prepared for that, but then they are left alone to actually deal with that. So, and in that regard, so that's why I do hope to do more coaching on that. How do we do helping people really to understand their life, to understand how they do, because I feel sad when I'm hearing what I'm hearing as stories about young LGBTQ person are either stopping working, really stupid, either stopping their lives, really also stupid, just because they are not prepared and they don't know. So that's basically a little bit what I'm actually interested in. And it is also in my parcours of life. This is also, I've been associate editor of Community Work and Family Journal. But when I had this problem at school, so I had to stop and I had to leave. I had to leave our colleague Richard alone. So I'm not anymore part, but I'm still part of the network. And I was also, so in that regard, the first one to introduce in Malmö a track on LGBT. So that was the first time we had LGBT in Community Work and Family Conference. And this is also something I did, and I would like also to have any help. We have also with another person, Jennifer, we have tried to develop also a branch in WFRN on LGBT, but we all know life has been a little bit shaking with everything. So this is an idea, but we need maybe new energy also for that. And I will be glad to share with you everything that you want. Thank you.
Thank you, John Charles. And now I'll turn it over to Deborah.
Thank you. So as you heard in the introductions, I am actually a law professor, so I approach these issues from a little bit of a different perspective, because much of my research focuses on how the law is or is not recognizing certain kinds of familial relationships, and then how that connects to what happens in the workplace, and also how the law with recognition can kind of shape the choices that families make in terms of how they're going to allocate responsibility for caregiving and breadwinning within families. And so I want to sort of emphasize that that's both with legal recognition matters both between adults. So obviously with the context of same-sex couples, there's been a whole movement towards whether or not they can lawfully marry and what that means, but also between adults and children. So there's a lot of complicated questions that can arise in terms of how you get recognized as a parent if you don't have a biological relationship with a child. and what kinds of functional parenting will be recognized as legal parenting and questions around that. And then once you are recognized in the United States and in many other countries, there's ways in which the law of marriage itself encourages specialization into different roles, with one parent prioritizing breadwinning and one parent prioritizing caretaking where you have both parents, and then questions around single parents and sort of how the law does or doesn't support single parents. I just kind of want to mention a couple of different areas of research that I've done related to those questions. So first, on that first point in terms of the law encouraging specialization in different ways, Abby's work and other work has highlighted ways in which same-sex couples, there was a body of research suggesting same-sex couples tended to divide responsibilities more equally than different sex couples, and most of that research, or a lot of it, predated legal marriage. I had sort of one line of research saying legal marriage itself can shape choices that couples make. And I'm not an empiricist, but wouldn't it be great if all of you would look to see, as couples get married, do patterns change, and what does that help us understand about what work the law is doing versus what work gender norms might be doing, and how to think about those questions. A second body of research that I've done has looked at parental leave policies. And of course, there's lots of ways in which different countries have experimented with how to allocate maternity leave, paternity leave, and parental leave with a conscious eye towards shifting gender norms. How are those policies working for same-sex couples and also single parents? And what choices are being considered or not in terms of how to modify those kinds of policies for different families. And then a third sort of line of my research has looked at workplace policies and state and federal laws requiring time off for caregiving. So sort of going to Abby's point about needing to take time off for your kids, but more generally needing to take time off to care for family, and how family is defined within laws that require that you get a chance to take time off. And so there's actually in the United States now a kind of exciting trend in several states to first protect time off, which we don't do in the US very well, but right to sick days, right to time off for medical needs, but also right to take time off to care for family members. And a lot of these laws are defining family very expansively. So definitely including unmarried partners, but also much larger sort of extended or chosen family. Some of the laws have language in it like somebody you consider your family, sort of full stop, like you get to decide who you think of as family. And then there's a whole host of questions if individuals seek to access, take time off, or, just even come out at work, what kind of protections they have against discrimination in the workplace, and how the sort of law of discrimination interfaces with the family recognition and questions around that. And then the last thing I will say is none of that really has anything to do with the trans community. But I do think that in addition to what we've heard about in terms of needs as trans people transition into parenthood, I think there's a whole different set of questions around trans kids, and particularly in the United States. So this current legislative session, lots of different states have passed bans on gender affirming care for trans youth, which means I think now that employers are going to be grappling with people that say, I need to move because my kid can't get the care I need, or I need you to change your health policies so that I can go out of state and get the care that my child needs, which is a very different kind of work family question than the way we normally think of it, but obviously is a work family question, which is what do employers do to support families when different locations pass laws banning certain kinds of key recognition of families or treatment or healthcare that families need. And the last thing I will just say is, I like going to WFRN events. I learn a ton, partly because there are no law professors basically to show up. But there are a lot of law professors that work on these issues. We publish in different journals. Most of them are not in Web of Science, but we think about really similar questions in ways that I think can be pretty generative. We use social science research all the time, but I just kind of urge you to think about connecting with this other discipline that's out there that's looking at these questions and thinking of them from a different but related perspective, because I think there's a lot to learn in those sort of interdisciplinary conversations.
Thank you, Deborah. And I will echo her point. I've learned a ton from Deborah and the way she thinks about leave policies and things that I hadn't considered. So I'm really excited to sort of hear this interdisciplinary conversation today. So I will turn it over to Alex to guide the panel discussion.
Thanks, Richard. So I jotted down a whole bunch of questions ahead of time. And of course, now I'm looking through them and trying to kind of match up, like, who should I ask what? But instead of targeting specific questions at specific panelists, I think I'll just blurt some stuff out, see who wants to respond. And I'd like to talk at some point this afternoon more specifically about policy and practice, both at the kind of organizational level and at the state or national level. But let's kick off by just thinking in more general terms, first of all, about research. What do you think are the key gaps in the literature right now with regard to work-family justice for this community of workers, with full acknowledgement that, as a few of our panelists have pointed out, you know, LGBTQ plus is really an umbrella term for a number of you know, subgroups with quite possibly very different needs.
Do you want me to take that since I talked about research?
Yeah, jump in. Anyone jump
Sure.
in.
So, I mean, in my own learning of, you know, the literature and trying to understand different social identities and how they've been studied in the context of, you know, various research that's out there. I mean, actually, along with what Deborah said, and I was kind of musing to myself about how the definition of family really trickles into every single institution we can possibly imagine. And as a sidebar, I was thinking about driver's education because my twins are driving and they can only drive with a family member right now for the first 6 months in Massachusetts. And we have a blended family and we're not really sure what that means. So anyway, total sidebar, but just another example of, you know, where things need to change. But in terms of the research, I mean, I think there is a very strong heteronormative assumption that is, you know, built into the research that has been done for many, many years. And I think we're only more recently starting to see, you know, journals, editors, reviewers who are a lot more amenable to, you know, accepting this kind of research, and then understanding that the majority of our research is from one particular lens, or, you know, a lens that doesn't necessarily reflect especially the LGBTQ population. So I mentioned that when we had that paper that was rejected at ASQ on same-sex families, just as an example, one of the things that they asked us to do in that revision was to compare, basically collect more data with straight people and make a comparison. And, you know, if I had a nickel for every time an editor or a reviewer would ask for that comparison, I'd be far more wealthy than I am now, because there's this assumption that you always have to compare. And yet, why do we have to compare? Why can't we just understand the lived experiences? I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm going to talk in terms of lived experiences for populations that we know nothing about. We don't need to compare. There's things that we can be doing in our research to just understand the population and maybe bring more theory into the literature. For example, with the paper that we did that's published now in AMJ on gender identity transitions and how they express gender, I think we made a really good contribution to the literature on authenticity that we wouldn't have been able to make had we not studied that population of individuals. And I mentioned it before, you know, we really looked at the evolving nature of authenticity. We're often told, even the rhetoric in the popular press is, be authentic, bring your authentic self to work. You know, we hear that all the time. What does that mean? And do we really know? We can't know how we're authentic until we express ourselves. And again, that was a study that I really learned about the evolving nature of authenticity and how you have to give a little to get a little, because we don't always know how to be our authentic selves. In that particular study, you know, these individuals were so excited to be authentic at work. But then when they started to do that, they weren't really sure that that really matched with how they felt inside, because they had to engage with others to do that. And some people pushed back, but a lot of people were very accepting. And without that interplay between trying to bring your authentic self to work and being accepted by others at work, you can't know how to be fully authentic. And we came to this notion that for some, being authentic enough is okay because it's evolving and changing, and, you know, we're learning as we're going. And for others, it's, you know, I'm going to be as best I can be who I am. And if nobody likes it, then I'll leave. I'll go somewhere where I can, you know, be more accepting. So I'll leave it at that in terms of the research and let others weigh in.
If I may, so I will join Jamie. So of course, I think this is first, this norm of good research is comparative research, generalization. So I think we need to continue to fight to get case studies, to get in-depth studies. But here in that regards, then came actually an issue that is access to data. That can also be really, or that is also really difficult, because it's impossible to go and knock. For me, I cannot, even in Sweden, I cannot go and knock in IKEA and say, hello, IKEA, give me access to your whole lesbian employee. No, it is not possible. So, I mean, also, so how do we, so which is a challenge, so getting this data. And this is sometimes what I've seen in some articles that I'm reading is often that they do actually compare because they do not have enough data about actually LGBT. So in order to be able, then they compare. So we are reproducing this idea that we will get better by reproduction. So this is also a challenge that is a method challenge. But it is also another challenge. It's these glasses. As you said, you started, Jamie, with heterosexual glasses. I mean, if we do want maybe to understand LGBTQ plus or just L or just Q, maybe we should really start without glasses, without being deductive and trying to see if what we know fit the population. But we should maybe really have more inductive study, grounded study, so that we really listen to the people. At least that's what I try to do in my research. As when I say, when I have a narrative perspective, is I really try to listen to what people are saying, what are the meanings that they do, and then try to make sense of it in a different ways. And what I have often found is that I do agree with you on the authenticity, but when I talk with LGBTQ, especially for me, more gay people, it is that authenticity is depending on your work-life preference. I mean, you may have a work-life preference for segmentation, and then your authentic work, your authentic self at work is JC at work. But it's not JC, gay person with gay clothes, with gay attitudes or whatever you want. So authenticity will also have to be connected with your life preference. At least that's what I feel. And what I feel is that it's being authentic in what I want to have, in what I want to achieve. You want to achieve your private life is your private life, your work is your work, separation. You achieve it, fine. And some people don't want that, and therefore they have their authenticity preferences. And for me, this is that we do have a lack of understanding because we have a lack of access of data. And then when we go to a journal and we say that we contacted individuals outside of the frame of organization as individual, blah, blah. Oh, how do you do your sampling? Well, so I think this is also really a mentality on how do we work in methodology. And I don't know if there are some people interested to work on, is there, or should we have an LGBT research methodology book, meaning how do we research on LGBT, and is that actually something we could have to do differently? Because I think this is part also of the issue in research, that we lack this knowledge because we lack the methodology behind.
I can speak next. First, I just want to say that there is actually a fairly solid emerging literature that does look at lesbian and gay and trans families in their own right. The problem is that it doesn't necessarily examine the intersections with work. So I think that's important to point out, that there is a lot of work now that I know Deborah is aware of, and others maybe, that is not comparative. And that's definitely a huge leap forward from, when I submitted my first grant and they just asked me for a comparison group and said, who cares about this small percentage of people? Why should we care? They only represent X% of the population. So a couple of key gaps I see. One is really looking at this intersection between, where people again live and where they work, which I'm so glad that Jamie brought that up. When people, when we think about, people even with trans kids, right? That is actually a very important work family issue. And I think it affects families in other ways. So for example, with all of the anti-trans, anti-LGBT sort of policies and laws being either, introduced or passed in various states, this is a work family issue. I just completed a study in Florida looking at how the Don't Say Gay law is affecting LGBT families in that state. And a fairly significant proportion of them were saying they wanted to leave, but their jobs and their family were keeping them in Florida. They had caregiving responsibilities to older adults. They had children who were in school who needed to graduate. Their workplaces, their jobs were the kind of jobs, that were not easy to find. And so they were looking, in fact, for more flexible options. So I think it's really important to think about how these larger policies and laws really interface with the kinds of laws that policies that workplaces provide, flexibility in where people live, for example. I really think there's a huge gap in terms of lower income and people of color. We still really know very little about low income lesbian and gay parents and work. What does work and family look like for lower income folks? Much of our research is really on middle class, upper middle class samples and predominantly white samples working in workplaces with, often, salaried as opposed to hourly wages, which is also an important context. And then finally, I want to point out that I've done some work on trans college students, graduate students, and new professionals, and it really shows how choices are made early and they shape people's career trajectories. So when we think about a trans person who's trying to figure out what workplace would be supportive of them as a trans person and supportive of them building a family, they're often making choices as early as, entering graduate school. Where will I go? What path will I pursue? I interviewed so many folks who were saying, there's these two potential pathways, say folks who were in education. I could go into education with young people, but nobody wants me as a trans person teaching their young children. So I'm going into administration. Another person saying, I got into this great school in the Midwest, but I can't go to the Midwest. I need to go somewhere on the East or the West Coast. So I'm giving up my favorite school so that I can go someplace that is more trans friendly. So thinking about these intersections and how they affect choices over the life course, I think is really important.
Yeah, I would just sort of build on that and echo that. I think they're both. I think what I think most people on this call would consider sort of harmful effect of bad anti-LGBT laws being passed different places, but also the positive effects of what's happening in some of the sort of more blue jurisdictions in the United States. So I mentioned these new laws that are very expansive in terms of letting workers just sort of say, this is a person I feel is my family and I need to take time off to care for them. It would be great to study that. Like, are people using them? How are they using them? Are they facing discrimination when they do use them? Are they making a difference? So build the framework as these policy interventions happen to look at what's working, what's not working, what's happening on the ground. And at least in the United States right now, across so many dimensions, there's wide divergence in terms of what's happening in family recognition, in anti-discrimination protections, in time off, in minimum wage. In all kinds of different issues that intersect and interplay with each other. But to really get a sense of what that means for families navigating these choices, how these different legal policy differences are being experienced and lived, I think that could be enormously helpful and important. And that's why I think, sort of productive partnerships between the people that can really understand what are the legal stuff going on versus what's happening in the lived reality would be so helpful.
Thank you very much. And I think that sort of bringing it around to policy and practice, I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. Obviously, we know that national legislation in terms of, protected groups and what kind of employment legislation, protects different types of workers. We know this varies considerably globally, but we also know that a lot of employing organizations will, comply with minimum standards as they legally have to, but some will go kind of above and beyond and institute their own supportive practices and policies. do we know if there are some industries or sectors that are doing a better job with work-family policy justice than others? And do we know kind of how they're doing a better job, what they're doing, and whether these can be replicated in different contexts? Or is it very much, as we've just been pointing out, that, you know, as a worker, it's almost the luck of the draw as to where you live in terms of like, this is what your experience is going to be?
I don't know a lot about specific corporate policies, but before I got on the call, I was just curious. So I went to look, I just Googled list of best companies to work for LGBTQ plus populations. And I was interested, it was a very long list from it was the Human Rights Campaign. I found it interesting that Anheuser-Busch was on there, the company that owns Budweiser. And, given I mean, I think that companies are well-intentioned, but there's a lot of performativity. There's policies. So they were on the list because they have great policies and practices according to their employees. So that's great. But just like with any other kind of research that we've studied or any other kind of underrepresented groups and work-life and work-family policies, if you don't have if it's just performative, or you have managers that don't really support them, or you're in locations, that don't support these policies or undermine these policies or practices, or you get social pressure because now the media is, creating some, political disruptions and so forth for these companies. I think it can be, really challenging. So I think that this age-old problem of policies, practices are great. I don't know any specific best practices. There's clearly a list. Maybe others can weigh in, but just because they have great policies and practices doesn't mean they actually, are moving the needle on them, or they're not just there and in a performative sense, and not really serving as allies in the way that, the LGBTQ plus populations might need them to be.
Is it okay to chime in or? Yes. Yeah, I when you say Anheuser-Busch, Jamie, are you thinking of the fact that there was that pushback about the transgender person that was an influencer and the whatever it was, Bud Light beer? Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because the pressure didn't come from the company itself initially. It came from, all the, the consumers who were, for whatever reason, and God knows why, so outraged that Budweiser would support her or use her in any way to be a positive spokesman for their product. But then the company did react in sort of an odd way by asking this very talented person to sort of take a step back and retrenching a little bit. So I'm not sure where they are exactly. We, the Center for Work and Family works with 50 member organizations, and I got to say, having worked on the other side in the corporate world, I am super impressed with what a lot of these corporations are doing to try to move forward the agenda for LGBTQ folks in terms of culture, in terms of policies, in terms of leadership. And, one of the ways they do it, which has come as no surprise to any of us, is through their ERGs. And so many of them have very active and very, very well populated, if you excuse the expression, but very well populated ERGs targeted at the LGBTQ population. We published a thing just recently on executive briefing, which our center publishes fairly frequently. It's about a 12 to 16 page publication that talks about what's going on in corporate America. And we have, I think, 4 examples of companies we work with and specifically what they're doing. So what I'll do, if I can figure out, I'm not a very technical person, as any of my friends know, but if I can figure out, I'll cut and paste the link in the chat. I guess, is that what I'm supposed to do? Okay. I may need some technical assistance, but I'll do that. And in that, it'll give you a pretty good sense of what's going on and give you 3 or 4 case studies of what is happening. And just last point is our center is about to embark on a qualitative study on how workplaces can support or do support working populations. And we've got a couple of companies that have already signed up and others that are very interested. So I think there is a lot of interest in this topic on the part of companies because, managers deal with an awful lot of complicated issues these days. And I think a lot of us, even who are in the field, have a hard time keeping up with, are we saying and doing the right things in terms of the LGBTQ population? So, my sense is that the people that are doing this pretty sincere, but always, as Jamie said, there's always a certain amount of, performativeness or whatever the term is, always. But I think that there are some really good things going on as well, which is just impressive. And there are fears on the part of corporations about, women and about, LGBTQ employees in terms of how have all these changes that are going on legally at either the state level or the national level, how are these things going to impact them? And a lot of them have moved in the cost effective mindset, have moved things to Texas and to Florida, where they formerly might have been in Massachusetts or New Jersey or California, to save money. And now all of a sudden they're realizing, that a lot of their employees, especially women and LGBTQ employees, are going to be adversely affected because they have these large installations down there, and the legal system is really striking against the rights of women and LGBTQ population. So I'll post that in the chat, and thanks for listening. And hi, Jamie.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting, and it's interesting to hear that perspective, because I live in the UK, and so we have we have Stonewall's sort of best companies to work for LGBTQ workers, and lots of great practices again showcased there. But I don't often see, not that they're not there, because I don't scrutinize everything carefully, but it's often about kind of leadership programs or representation at senior levels, or kind of general inclusive cultures. And there's I rarely, if ever, see anything specifically related to family. So that kind of intersection between work family issues and equality for LGBTQ plus employees rarely appears, which is again another reason why I was really interested in this afternoon session, because these are strands that I think don't often cross in the area of policy, practice, and research that I personally am familiar with. So it's nice to hear that this is taking place somewhere. Not where I am, but somewhere. That's good to know.
I'll just chime in quickly. Jamie mentioned the Human Rights Campaign. They actually do an annual report, the Corporate Equality Index, that tries to track this. I'll put the link in the chat, and they've changed their criteria over the years. And if you go back in old ones, you can see really interesting evolutions of the criteria in terms of, okay, you need to have an anti-discrimination policy. Okay, you need to have trans-inclusive healthcare benefits. Okay, you need to have all these other things. And then maybe 8 years ago, they started saying, oh, wait, is your company taking stands? What positions is your company taking on different issues as they're debated? And I think they also have a bunch of different best practices in terms of how do you support an employee who's transitioning? Well, you have a conversation with them about, how they'd like to handle that, and what pronouns, and how to handle if somebody misspeaks, and what bathroom they'd like to use. And, so they do have a lot of resources out there. Of course, there can be a gap between the written policies and what happens in reality when people try to use them, and how effective training needs to happen to make the policies as they're written play out as they should. But I'll put that link in the chat. They have a lot of great resources.
So I do hear in some of you, and it's normal, we look and observe what we have around here. So I hear a lot about the US perspective, and I do understand this difficulty with the different states. But I can tell you that in Europe, especially in the Nordic countries, where some of what you are actually discussing right now, Deborah, that you have to deal at state level, for us, it's at national level, and it's accepted. I'm not here, I'm in Sweden, but of course, Malmö is not far from Denmark. So I'm actually going a couple of times. We have in Denmark, in Copenhagen, there is a Danish network for business, LGBT-oriented business. So people, big organization, trying to put on the agenda how do they develop corporate policy. But they do that with already a really important national frame. It's already written in the Danish constitution. There is no right of discrimination, and the sex is already there. So, but we still have issues. And then in regards to your question, so Alexandra, when we listen to these companies, they often say and ask themselves, what do you do? Because I would like to do the same. But then they say, no, it doesn't fit, it doesn't go. And then we still see that in these companies that are so-called LGBT role model policy companies, that lots of people actually are stopping to work there. And when we look who is stopping to work and who is resigning, that are LGBTQ plus people. Because at the end, even if the company is doing a lot and so forth, at the end, there is also an individual. And we do see that in Copenhagen, it has been an increase of self-employed LGBTQ person. So this is really important to also understand that at one point, even if the company does everything that is possible, and I'm sure that some companies in Copenhagen do things even higher level than some in the US, it's still not always solving the issue, because at the end, there is an individual level, a family level, there is a group, this really complex system at different level. And some people so decide to be actually self-employed, to find this possibility of freedom of, as we had Jamie saying before, this authenticity and ourselves, and they only find the only possibility to be self-employed. This is also, as a last point, we talked about lots of groups. There is also a big differences between being LGBTQ plus in cities and LGBTQ plus in countryside. Because in the countryside, you have less opportunity of work. And therefore, you take the work where the work is. And therefore, your company wants to fit. You zip because your company wants to zip. In cities, it's a little bit more open. There is also this difference between rural LGBT and urban LGBT, and how is that also influencing the different choices. I don't know in the US, but I know that this is really strong when it comes to Sweden, where there are 3 major cities and the cities outside. There are lots of people in the small cities in Sweden, LGBTQ, that goes away from these cities because actually companies are not ready and because they are more ready in bigger cities. So this is also this distinction to do, I think. And we need also more research on that to be able to have better policy at a national level, regional level, and also company level.
Thank you. If I don't want to cut off any other panelists who wanted to jump in on that question, but if there's no more kind of comments on that, I was thinking a little bit, do you think that there are tensions between kind of work family practices and policies that are inclusive of LGBTQ plus workers and other protected characteristics? I think the one that springs to mind most readily is probably religious beliefs, right? Do we see tensions between kind of having policies that are enable greater work-family justice, greater equality, and that have to simultaneously respect other protected characteristics of workers within an organization?
I can jump in with a partial answer, which is to say that the courts definitely see tensions there. And they're being litigated, both in terms of employers that are religiously affiliated in different ways and are claiming that needing to comply with non-discrimination protections for LGBT folks is a counter their religious beliefs. In terms of individual employees who say, I need to be able to express my religious beliefs, and that's protected, even if it means that it's causing harm to other people. And then in terms of LGBT employees, sometimes who say, no, your expression of those beliefs is, feeling like harassment to me. And so I do think it's complicated, and this is from a US perspective. We have the First Amendment out there, which is a pretty strong protection of religious freedom and applies to employers as well as individuals based on the way the Supreme Court understands it. I think this particular Supreme Court is very expansive in the way it's understanding those kinds of religious liberty claims. And seems to be willing, and I've critiqued this, but seems to be willing to say that those kinds of claims are more important than the kinds of sort of sex equality or identity, claims on the other side that should be, I would say that being able to form a family with the people you love is also a constitutionally, protected fundamental liberty that bears a lot of protection. But in the United States, I think that we are likely to see some pretty significant religious carve-outs from the sort of general understanding that now it is clear that it is illegal to discriminate against somebody because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, that that's a form of sex discrimination and so therefore unlawful. But I think we are likely to see some pretty big religious exceptions as that law develops.
I'm thinking too about here in the UK, we haven't really gotten to the stage yet, I think, where work family policies and practices are being argued in terms of trans employees and trans parents. But we're seeing a lot of kind of pushback in terms of spaces for women, domestic abuse shelters, changing rooms, bathrooms, those usual suspects. But I'm thinking once we start looking at work family policies and, the new mothers groups and breastfeeding rooms and things like that, are we going to start seeing again those kind of pushbacks between whose rights need to be prioritized, right? Because there does sometimes seem to be a sense that not everybody can belong to a specific group and you kind of have to pick one. I'd like to talk more about intersectionality a little later too, and I think this feeds into that as well. It's if you belong to this group, then you can't come into my group and you can't do this. And I'm just curious as to how organizations are going to try to work out policies that are going to foster some kind of a climate of inclusion and still make sure that kind of, the majority of people using these policies are going to feel, I don't know what the word would be, respected, I suppose, protected.
So Alexandra, in regards to your question and your remarks here, when I listen to companies and also to LGBTQ, the issue, at least from a Europe perspective, this is not a comparison with, there is no issue of justice in regards, for example, to religion and anything. I think it's something that we don't compare because this is not comparable to compare my religion and my sexual orientation. It's like comparing Apple and something else. So it doesn't mean that when I listen to people, they don't compare that. But however, they do compare something. LGBT, so gay people versus lesbian people. The justice is more among the group, where some policies are favoring motherhood. Motherhood for lesbian people. Of course, you can have. It's genetic. It's genetic, Alexandra. You can have babies. But me, I can't. And then I need surrogacy. And surrogacy, I need to be maybe 6 months somewhere. I have friends who get surrogacy in Europe. They have to go in Canada for 3, 4, 5 months. How to do that without having a job? There we see actually a discrimination because a lesbian couple wanted to have a children. No problems, not normal. A gay guy couple wanted to have children. No access to actually the policy. So there is actually largely more, at least in what I'm listening, more comparison in terms of justice in treating sometimes LGBT as one, but then in reality, it's L on one side, G on one side, T on one side, and so forth. And there is actually more in what I listen, a challenge for the LGBT policies. To what extent the LGBT policies, if they are LGBTQ plus for LGBTQ plus, or are they actually oriented towards L on some aspect or one G on some aspect? And I listen really carefully. I have more and more trans person in my environment right now on the trans issue. So there is an issue of justice. That's what I'm listening actually. I don't know if other of you have experienced that, but this is more a question of comparison. But I've never heard a comparison, Muslim get possibility to pray and I don't have possibility. No, that I have not.
Thank you, Jean-Charles. That's an interesting tension sort of within the community. And this brings back this notion of, is this even a meaningful term in many senses, this LGBTQ plus? It involves, it kind of comprises a number of different sort of subpopulations with potentially very different issues, as you have pointed out. And and I've pointed out in my own research, as have many others who work with this community, especially the T part, right? Are any of these issues sort of the same for the T part compared to the LGB part? And we have a comment in the chat.
Exactly.
I just noticed somebody mentioning that, the bisexual population is often ignored in the LGBTQ plus kind of, umbrella group, in policy by researchers. And what are we, well, not me as the moderator, but what are the panelists, is there any attention paid to bisexual populations, in the research from those in the panel, and, how relevant to work family issues and to work family justice, is this?
I've done a lot of work actually on bisexual parents, not with a tremendous focus on work family, but with some. And I will say that, so the folks that I interviewed and followed over time were bisexual women partnered with men, looking at their experiences of invisibility, both in healthcare environments as well as in parenting environments. But I would say that absolutely also transcends to the workplace environment as well. So for many of them, like, their bisexual identity was important to them, and it was something that they felt was important in terms of their values and their political and commitments and their views on various things. They didn't feel like allies, and that was a big thing. So they, for example, wanted to be involved in their employee, resource group or whatever with LGBT issues, but they felt like they weren't really welcome there. And I think that the larger kind of bisexual invisibility that we perpetuate as a culture, where, that people would kind of look at them like, well, you're married to a man, like, why would you want to come to this meeting? That they felt that sort of at multiple layers and multiple levels. So I think frequently we forget about those bisexual people, or we denote their meaning or their value or their identity by virtue of the partner that they're with, and we just sort of see them as a same-sex couple. But many of those same-sex couples that I interview, they have distinctly different sexual identities, and so one partner might be queer, partner might be lesbian, but they're very clear that they have different identities. And I have done some work looking at the differences within couples and those implications for their relationship quality, for example. But for some folks, it's like someone telling you, we've got Christians and Catholics and Jews, but and some Muslims. We're going to group the Muslims and the Jews together because we don't have enough in each group. We're just going to kind of call them this other group, right? Or, we're just going to subsume the Catholics under the Christians. It just doesn't make much sense if that is an important identity for that person.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. I think it's a really important question to sort of flag the bisexual invisibility. For complicated reasons of legal analysis, what I just said about, like, it's clear that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation under US law now. There's people that say, actually, the way the Supreme Court thought about that, maybe it doesn't cover bisexuals. Other people think it does, but so that's being litigated. But I do think it gets to this, deeper question, like, in what ways is that identity distinct from the L and the G, and ways that should be recognized? Also, we haven't said anything about sort of gender non-binary people who face a whole bunch of different workplace issues connected to not wanting to, sort of fall into these categories, other kinds of polyamorous families, will employers recognize, these sort of more varied family forms and what they mean. And so I think that there's ways in which, there's a whole body of research sort of focusing on the focus on same-sex marriage as like a key marker of equality. And in some ways it was, but it also instilled, this like marriage, two people within a legal union, that's what, is the standard family form. And we just need to open it up to gay and lesbian couples in ways that's arguably been really harmful to all kinds of different kind of diverse identities. And to the extent that workplaces like those kind of cut and dried lines, it has all these ramifications as it plays out in the employment context.
Mm-hmm. May I also challenge you? We often talk, and he's totally right, and Deborah, that's how we talk about couples. In the LGBT community, especially the G community, couple is an outdated idea, and couple does not exist. It's triple, and it's open relationships, and so we also need not only to have the same sex to question the same sex, but we need also to question this idea of couple, if it's couple and family also. And I don't know why, but I have observed that the pandemic of so-called COVID-19 has opened lots of possibility of how do you do relationship in so many ways. I don't know why, but that's what I observe. So really difficult. Yes, indeed, Pamela, we should talk about maybe family composition, or I don't know. It's also these sort of terms that are stigma and can be stigmatization also in organization. It's not only the content of the policy, but it's how do we formulate the policies also that can be really stigmatization and make that some people feel excluded or less included. It's really sensible.
And I think both in the research and probably in the policies as well, that, you know, there's often this lump everybody into the same group mentality, which obviously doesn't work. And Alex, you mentioned the trans community. I mean, I know from our study, you know, one thing we suggest for human resource practices, and there might be some best practices out there for trans people going through gender identity transition, it's a much longer experience, right? There could be a social transition that's happening initially, and then maybe over time, a physical transition. And so it's not, you know, that might be different for, you know, lesbian, gay populations or bisexual populations, where it's a matter of policies that support them from a work family perspective. But this is about, you know, a gender identity and medical perspective. So there's a much longer time frame. And one of the things we found, I mean, it was anecdotal in our research, and obviously it was only from the, you know, the trans individuals' experiences, but that was where they started to get a lot of pushback from people in HR and even from their managers, because it was fine that they came out, it was fine that they wanted to transition, but then when it kept going, it was kind of like this mentality of, okay, it's enough already. When is this over? Just be done. Let's move on. And it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, very, very much so. I think you're right. And I think it's really interesting to start sort of assessing some of these differences when it comes to work family issues within organizations, and coming back to this idea of intersectionality that we keep coming back to, which I think shows how inherent it is to so many of the issues that we as a research community discuss, regardless of whether it is about LGBTQ workers or work family or whatever, because identities cannot be as neatly encapsulated as perhaps, you know, organizations and researchers would like them to be, right? We'd be like, okay, this is who I'm studying. You know, organizations like tick this box and this is where you fit. And that doesn't work. We all have, you know, these sort of multifaceted identities. So thinking about the intersection then of sexual orientation and or gender identity and gender expression with other protected characteristics or strands of diversity, let's say, are there LGBTQ plus workers that we think might have unique challenges with regard to work family justice, either at a, you know, organizational or kind of a national or societal sort of perspective? Which, you know, subgroups or which combinations would it be, I think, important for us to look at, you know, as a research community who's struggling?
I mean, I was thinking about this in reflecting on some of the questions that you had sent out, and this is my answer is gonna be strictly around research, because for those who know me, I'm a total research nerd and get really nerded out about like how we can understand certain populations and really advance our, you know, our research agendas around, you know, ways that may have been limited in the past. And I just see a real fruitful direction in research and literature about drawing from intersectionality, which was, you know, originally around race and gender and the intersections of race and gender, you know, and the historically marginalized experiences of being, you know, Black and being a woman. And I'm not 100% convinced that that's the right lens to understand the intersection. I mean, no, it's still an intersection, but the intersection of LGBTQ and gender or race and or any other social identity. I'm not saying it's not intersectionality, but it could be something else, or it could be. So I think that's where the opportunity lies to understand, you know, the different dynamics that are happening when you intersect these different identities. Sorry, there's a noisy, I don't know, lawnmower or something behind me. So I just think historically marginalized versus newly marginalized, I don't know if that's a fruitful area of, you know, of research to think about how or how identities evolve over time, because there's still so much we don't know about LGBTQ plus populations that is emerging. And so anyway, I mean, I just think there's ways to dive into research and think about this. Is this really intersectionality? Is it something else? Is it intersectionality plus something else going on, you know, in the literature that we can learn about?
So I don't know if I will answer your question, Alexandra, but to what I see is a lot also a question of age, because it's a question of identity, and when does the identity and the work identity gets constructed. And even in our Europe that is said to be open, and even in France, because I'm French, if you did not understand from my English, even if in France we have the droit de l'homme, there is largely more social tension on accepting, actually. So the discourse of open and gay marriage, and in France it's in 10 years already, gay marriage, but it's still a lots of tension at the national level, societal level. Lots of people who do hide actually their sexual orientation, not only at work, but in the society, because of some sort of insecurity. And it is a lot at the young people, because there is a shift of their culture and their values. And maybe it has been really quick, really fast, and they have trouble to actually understand what does that really mean in terms of identity. So to me, I'm really also trying to, I would like to cross more with age, or with maybe not age, but with not employee life cycle, but life cycle only, with the life cycle. So that, I think, to me, or generation, it could be a generation, but also I think when you are only alone in university, maybe there is something. When you start the work, there is something else. And then when you get a second work, so I do also believe there is some sort of something to cross there. I do believe. I don't know, just out there.
I think maybe just going back to the way you originally framed the question, who's struggling from a work family, I think that the research that shows that the LGBTQ population is more likely to be poor or just out of poverty is enormously important, because we know poor workers in general are really struggling in all kinds of ways. And so I think being attentive to that, in addition to sort of these other markers of identity, is really, really important. And, you know, like I put the HRC index up there. That's like large corporations that have well-developed HR departments and, you know, sort of get on their radar. That's really different from where people are working at a gas station, struggling, don't know how to talk to a manager, don't know what their rights are. You know, so I think that being attentive to different, you know, this goes a little bit with what Abby said, but different work contexts, and particularly the sort of edge of the working poor and the whole range of challenges that anybody in that sector, at least in the American economy, really faces, compounded with different kinds of discrimination and stigma, that there's probably a lot of work to be done at that edge.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're thinking about like workplace support, right, we all know that like there's the big organization or the corporation. So I'm thinking like, you know, about my trans colleagues who work in universities where their universities have terrible policies that, you know, don't allow them, for example, to get the gender affirming care that they need. But then their department, right, is very supportive and filled with really thoughtful, compassionate people who want to do everything they can to make this easier for them. And of course, that's people with a lot of privilege even to be in a university setting. But again, never forgetting these different layers of potential support or non-support. And the example that Deborah gave, like, you know, somebody working in a gas station or somebody working, you know, in a low-wage job, you know, how many, you know, we know that, for example, education level is often linked to attitudes around LGBT rights. You know, what kinds of workplace environment are they in? Where, you know, what's the kind of overall climate around LGBT issues? There probably are not a lot of resource groups or resilience building resources to kind of enable people to feel supported and resilient and like they can be their authentic self in any environment. So just always thinking about, you know, colleagues and supervisors and, you know, not just the corporation that you may work for, but all of the other little sort of ways that we get support at work.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm so delayed. By the time my finger is so slow to press on the mute button. I know where it is. Now, finally, after like what, 3 years of using this technology, I finally know where things are, but it still takes me a while to get through it. We are reaching the point where we're going to turn over the discussion and the questions to the rest of the group beyond the panel. But I wondered if I could sneak in one last question first, maybe just a quick 1 or 2 liner from each of the panel members. Where do you want to go next personally with this line of research? Not necessarily what are you going to be working on next, or what's your definite plan for the next 6 to 12 months, but in an ideal world, where would you personally like to take your research in this area next? Someone jump in, anyone.
For me, we all have our theoretical glasses or lenses. So from my theoretical lenses of boundary management and development, so my interest is really to understand, do we, because of our sexual orientation, do we have different life domains? Are they at the differently built? So for our identity, which one is becoming important, and how do I navigate with that? And there is a question in the chat from Carrie about single, and that's what I saw, is that when we are single, is it your single identity that you put first, or is it your gay identity that you put first? And in that regard, so then that create actually a different type of problems. So personally, I'm really interested to get more into the individual story making, narrative making on their life puzzle. That's in order to be able to understand whatever diversity, if there are diversity, and to understand where they are. That's where I would like to take the field for my research.
I mean, this isn't necessarily specific to my research per se, although I am interested in the intersectionality argument. I'm just super happy that so many editors, we're seeing so many special issues. Alex, I know you have one. I'm part of one with OBHDP on, exploring allyship and advocacy and social justice to support marginalized employees. It's not specific to LGBTQ, but we do have some papers in there that are focused on that. I'm happy being a reviewer or serving as an editor and seeing that these papers make it. I mean, obviously they have to be, they have to meet the standards of the journals, but happy to see these issues being, shining a light on them through our research, I think is super important. And I'll leave it to the practitioners out there. I think the stuff that Brad is doing, for example, at the Center for Work and Family is great when it comes to, looking at the companies and practices that work well. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'll just say I'm going to be working on a large project with some collaborators, including some legal professionals, looking at marriage equality and the effects of marriage equality on LGBT folks in states that passed it sort of at various phases prior to 2016. And so something I'm interested in is the extent to which, I think Deborah, you kind of mentioned this initially around marriage and division of labor. I'm really interested in how marriage interfaces with a lot of these things in terms of, did folks feel more recognized as a family at work when they got married or when marriage equality was passed? What kinds of implications did that have, for policies, for leave? We know it has implications for like whether people can adopt, because in some states you can't adopt unless you're married. So actually looking at the interface with marriage, I think, is really important, especially as, some folks are concerned about a year up to challenge Obergefell. So that's partly sort of the initiative for this work.
Yeah, and I think I've already kind of signaled it, but I think in general, where people see, quote, good policies, it would be great to show that they are helping and making a difference across, a whole different range of metrics. That I think that well, A, it feels nice to be celebrating something that's actually working, hopefully. B, if it's not working, it'd be good to know it. But I just think that being able, there's so much that needs to happen to pass a policy. And then I think sometimes there's not enough sort of like, okay, now how is it playing out? Is it having its intended consequences? Is word getting out? Is it being used? That piece of sort of a policy implementation gets understudied, and it's really, really important.
Thank you, everyone, for indulging my my one last question. And now I'd like to move on and take a few of the questions from the chat that participants have been putting in. So we have a couple of them here, and I think Jean-Charles is ahead of the rest of us in answering things in the chat. But Carrie had mentioned a little bit further back that she would welcome any insights that people on the panel have from their research on single, gay, lesbian, or bisexual people in the workplace, and how their experiences might differ from those of people with similar identities, but who are in relationships. Do we have any insights on that from any of our panelists or anyone else here?
I don't have a full answer, except for to say that I think single people in general, whatever sexual orientation, feel really undervalued in the workplace. So there's all kinds of like family, and the very sort of particular understanding of that, and that there's a lot of issues that come from that. And as I mentioned, I had done some work on single parents and parental leave policy, and sort of like dipped a toe into sort of the single advocacy world more generally. And there's a lot of questions that arise and way people feel undervalued for choices that they're making.
Okay, I'm waiting to hear if anyone else kind of unmutes their mic and speaks up about single parents, but nothing right now, I guess. We also had a question from, sorry?
The question was not only about single parents, it was about single gay.
Sorry,
So
yeah, but we're talking about, yeah, you're right.
Which is also another issue, but in my observation is what I have seen and what I hear when my coaching with some of my coaches, when they are single, this is a single issue. So they are comparing themselves to single people. So making sure, and their sexual orientation does not come into consideration. So it's more, I am single and they are couple, there we are, injustice. But it's not, I'm gay and they are heterosexual, that's not. So this is in that regards another type of injustice between single people and couple people. And in that regards, what I have experienced is that sexual orientation does not matter in that regards. The issue is more, what I see, I think in Europe, even if we have a good elderly care, this is more because I'm single and my parents are actually in a elderly home, then I have the same issue that if the others has parents. That's more in that regards, but not in comparison with sexual orientation, not with gay. I have not experiencing that. Maybe some people in the audience have seen something else.
Well, that was a good reminder that, you know, we were just talking about parental leave and maternity leave a moment ago. So my mind automatically went there, but talking about lenses, right? I've published papers on how, you know, family composition needs to be more, you know, diverse and kind of, you know, we need to see that through a lens that it's not all about the nuclear family. But yeah, I don't concentrate for 5 seconds and my mind goes straight back there. So it shows how socialized you can become without even realizing it. Tammy had mentioned something about sampling, and I think the LGBTQ plus population has traditionally been considered a quote unquote hard to reach population compared to, well, you know, and we talk about lower income workers being hard to reach as well, because I think the usual suspects are people like us who, you know, have university degrees and work in offices and they all have the internet. We'll just send them a link to a survey and they'll fill it out and then, you know, that's it, right? Like, but how do we go about, does anybody have any insights into how we go about accessing hard to reach populations such as members of the LGBTQ plus community, and perhaps especially, you know, some members, I personally have found that the trans community can be even more difficult sometimes to reach than other members. Any insights into how people navigate that?
Did Tammy mention in what context she was thinking of doing the research?
I think it was a student. Tammy, did you want to pop in?
Sure. Yeah, my student is researching lesbian and gay workers on their work and family experiences and touching on boundary management issues. And it's been such a challenge for him to collect even just a couple of hundred participants. So that's what's prompting my question. And I have another student who's interested in doing this research, but is now scared off because of the experience that he has had.
I mean, we work a lot, as you know, Tammy, with very large corporations, and the way we're accessing people, but it's for a qualitative study, but the ERGs, you know, the employee resource groups that are targeted at LGBTQ, you know, organizational members has been the best conduit to get the word out to them. So I don't know if that's helpful, but if, you know, and not every workplace, obviously, especially small workplaces, would necessarily even have an ERG, but they've been very, very good about sort of being a channel through which we can connect with that employee population, where just going through a standard HR without that kind of a connection would be extremely challenging, I would guess. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, it's great to get into large corporations, like Brad is able to. Sometimes it's often difficult to do that, even as a researcher, to tap into that. But you know, I mean, I found that there are Facebook groups and other social media oriented groups that are, and you might find that people are more likely to share, and they're members of that group because they want to share and they want to learn from other people. I mean, there's some restrictions sometimes on, you know, being able to do research on those groups, but they are there and often willing to. And there's also, I mean, if you're doing qualitative research, there's a snowball sampling usually happens too, where you interview a couple people and you ask them to share, you know, or give you names of others that might be interested.
I think this is where researcher positionality also comes into play, because I've worked on the papers with where the lead author was a member of the community. She was a trans woman, and she belonged to various organizations that had like discussion forums, you know, online. And so after getting permission to recruit for her study online, but she would you know, post messages, and because she was a member of that, you know, discussion group already, people recognized her name, they trusted her. She wasn't some rando coming in from, you know, university or whatever, saying, I want to look at you all through a microscope and study you. And so that generated more participation and better recruitment for a particular study than would have been the case had it just been, you know, the other authors in the paper who we like to think of ourselves as allies, but we're not insiders, right? You know, we're outsiders in terms of that population. So sometimes it can, you know, depend kind of on where you as the researcher are positioned in terms of how not easy it's going to be, but how much more difficult it might be to access certain populations. And I'm sure that's true of all sorts of populations, not just the LGBTQ plus community. Okay, I am looking now. Sorry, I'm trying to talk to everybody and also scan through the questions in the chat. Okay, we've got a question from Joanna. How do you think organizations impact how same-sex couples make decisions on their family formation, i.e., who carries the child, who takes parental leave or adoption leave, etc.? That's a really interesting question. And I'm sure, I mean, I have seen other research and done other research about how organizational policies can, you know, shape people's decision-making, but I don't know much about the specific topic. Does anyone else in the panel know about this, or other members of the audience here?
I mean, I can briefly just say that when I did actually ask folks about, you know, sort of how did you decide who would carry the child, and workplace issues were invoked frequently. So I have the better leave, I get more time off, I have a more flexible schedule, I'm less worried about losing my job, for example, when I return. So that absolutely dictated or influenced some folks' decisions when there weren't other more pressing issues like fertility, for example. And a big consideration was actually coverage of fertility treatments. So the ability to cover, for example, in vitro or hormones, for example.
Great, thank you, Abby. And Joanna is following that up with, did you find that this matched research participants' personal preferences, independent of organizational policy?
I would say that it was like usually a factor that they named along with other factors. I don't think I ever spoke to a couple where one person was like, I absolutely didn't want to become pregnant, but I did because, you know, I had the better leave. It was more like one of a few important things. But I could see how that could happen, that the person who really is less healthy or much more reluctant could end up being the person to carry because the other person just has such, you know, oppressive policies, or it's just impossible, especially if they're the higher earner. So sometimes too, these were like folks who could take time off because their partner made more money.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this back over to Richard now, because I think we've reached the end of our time.
I was going to say, we have reached the end of our allotted time. I know that there's still some comments in the chat. So I want to thank all of the panelists, as well as Alex, for your insights, the great conversation. I want to thank the audience, you know, for your interesting questions. And it seems like we could continue this discussion, lots and lots to talk about, lots and lots to research. And so thank you all for attending this event. I do want to let everyone know there will be another a virtual conference series event in June about new data from the World Policy Analysis Center that will be publicly available to everyone.